Okay, with pleasure, I'm going to introduce Michael or Mike Giannacco, who is the former chief of the Civil Rights Section for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of California. He is among the nation's foremost experts in civil rights and law enforcement. Mr. Giannacco has contributed to numerous reforms in policing and accountability systems across the country, working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve. He recently signed a contract with the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors. He's the independent auditor for the Santa Cruz City Police Department, closer to us here in Monterey, but he's also Inspector General for the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Department, Inspector Monitor for the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office, and independent police auditor for the Palo Alto Police Department. It's easy to see why he is such a sought-after speaker and why we are so fortunate to have him with us today. Mr. Giannacco, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And the only error that you made is I go by Mike or Michael Giannacco, not Mr. Giannacco. That's my departed dad. So with that being said, it's really great to be with you all this lunchtime hour, and I look forward to discussion. I am a trained attorney, so I can go on all day. I promise I won't, but look forward to the questions and perspectives that you all may have toward, after my opening remarks, where the rubber will hit the road. Perhaps it would be helpful to you all just to give you a little bit of a 50,000 foot sense of who I am and my experience, and how I got into oversight. The older I get, the longer this takes, but I will try to keep it at a higher level. As Sharon indicated, after I graduated from law school, I went to work for the Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C., started out doing voting discrimination cases. And after a couple years, I moved over to the criminal civil rights section, which, by the way, if our current president gets his way, there may be nobody in that section after the next few months. But nevertheless, it was a vibrant section at the time, and I had cases all over the country. My work involved civil rights violations that rose to the level of criminal behavior. So those included hate crimes. I actually prosecuted individuals who had actually did cross burnings back in the day, and other kinds of racial animus. I did human slavery, modern day slavery cases as well, human trafficking. But the work that I did there that is probably the most relevant to today's discussion is I investigated and prosecuted law enforcement officers who had violated the rights of individuals, and in the appropriate cases, asked grand jury for indictments and prosecuted those officers in federal court. I probably had 20 or so different prosecutions in 17 or so different jurisdictions throughout the country in that work. I then transferred over to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, Central District of California, and did the same kind of work for another 6 years. And then at the turn of the century in 2001, I then began my work in oversight. At the time, the sheriff of LA County was interested in creating oversight. He welcomed it. He thought it was important to have. It wasn't behind a crisis involving his agency that caused him to advocate for oversight in the county, but he was seeing what was going on in LAPD at the time. And if you recall, at that time, around 2000, 2001, that was the height of the Rampart scandal, which was one of a series of scandals that LA has unfortunately had to experience with their police department. And what the sheriff thought was, why don't I bring some oversight on board so that I am ready the next time my agency is hit with a scandal. Um, I then moved over to Oversight and did that work for 13 years with LA County. And then after that experience ended in 2014, I was able to branch out and do the other work that Sharon has talked about. Um, I am going to focus my remarks primarily on the sheriffs in LA, in the state of California, because I think that is what brought at least the league together with regard to pushing on Monterey. I have to say, though, before I leave the cities, that it's a little disappointing that there are no independent cities in your county that have any oversight either. And maybe we can have a discussion another day about that. Um, as I will say in my remarks, it's a lot easier to get oversight going in the cities than it is in the county for some reasons that I will enumerate in a minute. But you know, there has not yet been a city that has been courageous enough to adopt oversight in the county, as far as I know. Um, and in the cities, oversight is growing by leaps and bounds. We are way ahead of the counties or the sheriff's offices with regard to oversight in the cities of California. Almost every year, there's another 4 or 5 or half a dozen cities that get on board with oversight, and that's great. And consistent with former President Obama's 21st Century Task Force, which they only adopted 5 pillars in that oversight report that you may want to read if you haven't read recently. I think the words are still prescient and the concepts are still prescient. But they had uh, the the ad hoc committee came up with 5 different pillars that they thought was required as law enforcement moved into the 21st century. And one of those pillars is some type of meaningful civilian oversight over law enforcement. I just wish more law enforcement executives had adopted that concept as part of their strategic plans. And some have, but unfortunately, that oversight pillar has been left behind by some. Um, I will talk a little bit about what I think is crucial for there to be effective oversight. And I think effective oversight is really the that adjective needs to be added to oversight, because if you have oversight that is not effective, in some ways, it's worse than not having any oversight at all. And I'll talk about what I think are the essential elements of oversight. It's not just me, it's based on my experience. It's what NACOL, which is the National Oversight of Civilian Oversight, is also our national group, also recognizes these essential qualities of oversight. But before we do that, I want to trace a little bit historically the history of oversight in the sheriff's departments and sheriff's offices in the state of California. Um, in the 1980s, no sheriff's departments had any oversight at all in the state of California. None, zero, zippo. The first to come on board was San Diego County. And San Diego County in the late 90s adopted some kind of oversight. It's had its growing pains, it's had its ups and downs over the years, but to their credit, it was the first oversight group over sheriff's departments in the state of California. The second, and I may have, you all may be better historians than I am. This is just going from memory and experience, but I believe the next one to come on board was the one we started up in LA County in 2001. Based on that experience and based on the good work that I think others saw us doing there, about 10 years into it, about 2008 or 9, 10, something like that, Orange County came on board and adopted oversight. And we were stuck there for a while with those three agencies being pretty much the sole agencies over Sheriff's Department in the country, are in the state of California. Those you may recall, we have 58 counties in the state of California. So 3 out of 58 wasn't a great number, but it was better than 0. Sacramento came on board around that time, 2014, 15, something like that. They've had their growing pains, but they do have something. And then right around 2020 in that area, we got Santa Clara County on board. And we, as Sharon indicated, we are the monitors, auditors for Santa Clara County. Santa Cruz followed after that. And we are also the Inspector General for Santa Cruz County. Sonoma County came on board right around that time as well, a little before that. And they still have a fairly vibrant oversight entity in Sonoma County. And San Francisco, which is a city and county. They're contiguous with each other, but San Francisco County's Sheriff's Department does have oversight and is trying to improve that oversight system as we speak. So where are we up to now? We're up to 8. 8 out of 58 is getting better. It's still a small percentage, but you can see that there is continued interest and growth with regard to overseeing sheriff's departments. I know that other agencies are involved. San Mateo has something like oversight. The seeds and embryos of oversight are starting to grow in San Mateo County. They just had a historic election a few days ago, so we'll see what happens in San Mateo County. And I've worked with those folks as well. Good to see some representatives on this call. Alameda's talking about it. There's been a change in the district attorney and county government there, so we'll see. The Eureka grand jury, we are the independent police auditors for the city of Eureka. The grand jury has recommended oversight for the county of Eureka. So far, the sheriff has said he's not interested, but we'll see. Let's talk about what I think are the essential qualities of oversight, and they really boil down to 3 areas. One is access. And when I'm talking about access, I think in order for an oversight entity to have any effectiveness, they're going to have to be able to have access to all information coming out of the law enforcement agency. We're talking about highly confidential information. We're talking about information that's protected by 832.7 and the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. We're talking about internal investigations. We're talking about officer-involved shooting investigations. We're talking about internal investigative reports. All of that information needs to be accessible to the oversight entity. In addition, the oversight entity also needs access to people within the agency that are the decision makers with regard to internal investigations, use of force, regarding other aspects of what is going to be audited by the oversight entity. And without that access, you're not going to have a successful oversight entity, in my view. The second thing that is, I think, critical for any effective oversight entity is the oversight entity needs to be independent. It needs to be, the entity cannot work for the head of the agency, has to be independent from the head of the agency, has to have a track record of independence. In all of our assignments, we have resisted becoming employees of the counties that we are overseeing for that very reason. Because when you're an employee, you're really not as independent as you are if you are a private contractor. Employees have to work for somebody within the county organization. And when you're an independent contractor, you have that independence where you don't have to work for anybody. Um, there are people that are independent that do sort of walk that tightrope and are employed by the county, but I do think for those individuals, it creates more challenges with regard to retaining that independence than it would for us who are independent and outside the county machinery, if you will. The third piece, I think, and critical piece of oversight is the need to be able to be transparent with regard to the work that the auditor, the monitor, the inspector general, the oversight entity, the commission is doing. Um, so there has to be a recognition and an understanding that there will be regularly produced reports, public reports, not confidential reports, public reports that the public will be able to read, learn from, learn what's going on in the county or the entity, and see what the auditor is seeing, what the monitor is seeing in an effective way. Without that transparency, I think any effectiveness that an auditor or monitor or any oversight entity might have will be lost. Um, and one of the goals or objectives for oversight, of course, is to increase confidence in law enforcement. And that confidence cannot be increased unless the public has an understanding of what the auditor, what the monitor, what the oversight entity is doing. And that public reporting is so critical. Um, so one analogy that I use about independent oversight is that there needs to be an entity that has the ability to lift up the hood of the organization, get in there, shine the flashlight around, see what's going on, and report back in a public report about what they're finding, all within the understanding that some reporting is going to be limited with the auditor will be limited because of state law on exactly what kind of reporting can be done. That doesn't mean that no reporting can be done. A lot can be done. The story can be told. Uh, there may be limitations on naming the deputies involved in the events pursuant to state law, but a lot of transparency can be provided. And compared to what counties, county public sees in Santa Cruz County and Santa Clara County, now that we've got going with our public reporting, versus counties that don't have any oversight, it's a difference between several hundred pages of reporting over the course of a year versus 0 pages of reporting over the course of a year. So that difference is stark and I think critical. Um, what is it that makes sheriffs different than cities, and why is it so difficult or much more difficult to get oversight going in a sheriff's office than a city department? I think that really boils down to uh, the structural differences between the way in which sheriff's offices are governed and the way in which city police departments are governed. Let's take city police departments first. In city police departments, you have elected officials, city council, that are the elected representatives of the city. They chart policy. Um, they make many important decisions as elected officials, but unlike some of the more historical, traditional, bigger cities in the East and Midwest, most of our city governance is through the city manager type model. There are a few exceptions, I would say, like, for example, San Francisco has a relatively strong mayor. Um, but for the most part, most agencies, most cities in California are run by city manager, which means that the day-to-day administration of the employees of the city are managed by the city manager. Um, and the city manager generally has very much authority on how the city is run on a day-to-day basis. The elected officials are setting policy and making decisions on, budgetary issues, et cetera, et cetera. But the city manager is the linchpin of what makes the city go. As one of the responsibilities, the city manager has the authority to hire and fire the police chief. Um, Sometimes that requires the approval of city council, but usually the city manager is able to make that choice. That gives the city manager a lot of authority over the chief. It also means that the chief works for the city manager. And therefore, the city manager, if the city manager and his elected council want oversight, they get oversight. And the chief really has to go along with that, can't say no to that, and has to sort of work through that. And that's just the dynamic that exists. And I think that is one of the reasons we have a higher percentage of cities in California that have oversight than we do for sheriffs. Because in contrast, uh, if you look at the way counties are governed in California, you have a board of supervisors, which is equivalent to city council. They're usually a smaller group, but they serve pretty much the same function. And then you have a chief administrative officer, or sometimes they're called chief executive officer, that sort of fills the role of city manager, but not exactly so. Because you also have an independently elected sheriff. Um, and that's where it becomes complicated. So the sheriff is elected by the whole county. Many counties have districts. And so a supervisor is often just representing a portion of the county, whereas the sheriff is elected by the whole county. There aren't 5 sheriffs, for example. There's one, and he or she runs and is elected by the whole populace. And under the California Constitution, the sheriff can rightly say that she or he does not have a boss, because they don't. Their only boss really are the voters. Um, and so that, I think, is the reason that oversight has had a harder time uh, getting ingrained into a sheriff's department. All that being said, if a sheriff wants oversight, the sheriff can get oversight because the sheriff's the boss. So, and LA County is maybe the best example of that. We had a situation where the sheriff at the time said, I want oversight. Supervisors, will you fund an oversight entity for me? And the supervisor said, heck yeah, if you want it, you got it. And true to his word, the sheriff at the time, who was an advocate of oversight, um, gave us all of that freedom, all of those responsibilities that I had talked about earlier. So we had complete unfettered access to all information, to all of the decision makers. We were independent. We didn't work for the sheriff. We worked sort of for the Board of Supervisors through a contract. And thirdly, but they left us alone. They let us be independent. And then the third part is we were able to publicly report on what we were seeing and what we were doing during the tenure that we were there for 13 years. And I would have to say that was that oversight impactful? I know from experience that it definitely was. People were held accountable that would not have been held accountable but for the existence of oversight for those 13 years. People were disciplined if that would not have been disciplined but for the existence of oversight. Better guidance and better policies were adopted, things like a foot pursuit policy, a shooting at moving vehicles policy. Other policies were created as a result of the oversight entity in LA County that would not have happened but for the existence of that oversight entity. And when I'm talking about oversight, one thing that I think um, it's a little bit of a fine point, but I think it's an important one to make, is that uh, philosophically, the way I see oversight is that oversight isn't so much evaluating deputy conduct or misconduct, um, but really the focus is on the agency and how well the agency is addressing allegations of misconduct. So what we're looking at lieutenants, sergeants, captains, and people in the chain of command that have responsibility for fully, thoroughly, and objectively investigating allegations of misconduct. And then when the evidence shows that there was a violation of policy and misconduct, that appropriate action is taken consistent with the level of misconduct. And when we are critical of agencies, and by gosh, we are critical of agencies, when criticism is due, then um, it's really the criticism is leveled at the investigative part. The criticism is looking and critical of, you did not do a thorough investigation in this case. You did not do an objective investigation in this case. And it's not looking at the deputy who is the subject of the investigation so much as criticizing the investigative machinery of the entity itself. The same is true with regard to accountability on founded cases. Um, we are looking at the highest levels of an agency who usually make these determinations, whether or not um, a person is going to get a slap on the wrist based on a very serious offense, or whether that person is going to be divorced from the agency. That's the stark example of what I'm talking about. And so while most discipline is intended to be remedial, um, in the cases in which the misconduct is so significant that the deputy should not be wearing a badge anymore, then it's our responsibility of oversight entities to persuade the law enforcement leader that that's the right call. And if we believe that the leader has made the wrong call, then it's our responsibility to call out the leader of the organization for making that bad call, not so much the deputy who has strayed and committed misconduct. So I think that's the difference of focus that comes out of this dynamic based on my 20 some years of doing this work. Um, I um, could go on, I think, for a while. I think maybe I'll just end with just a few final comments and then be available for any questions or discussions that my comments may have engendered. I have heard from detractors of oversight that one, it's not necessary because there's all kinds of other oversight that is over law enforcement. Um, I do agree that there is some built-in checks and balances with regard to oversight. So for example, um, when there's an officer-involved shooting, it's usually the district attorney that is looking at whether or not there's criminal behavior, criminal conduct on behalf of the officer that was involved in that shooting. I know that we have a whole system of civil litigation that is also out there and will result in liability and damages paid out as a result of law enforcement conduct that is found to be unconstitutional or in violation of law. And we have a board of supervisors in the county that does have a lot of influence over the budget, of a sheriff's department, for example. But those kinds of oversights are not the kind of oversight that we are talking about here. Those are really incremental, tangential, and don't really move the organization in a significant way. So, for example, civil litigation, while oftentimes there will be payouts, there will be judgments, there will be settlements. In my experience, it's rare, other than the fact that the county has to pay the damages, it's rare to see any kind of systemic reform coming out of that kind of process. The damages are paid, the county moves on, and it's kind of the cost of doing business. With regard to the cost of oversight, it's hard to, I think if you compare, I think a very vibrant, robust oversight entity, which is what we have in Santa Clara County and in Santa Cruz County. If you compare what we are receiving compared to the whole budget of the sheriff's office, it's a drop in the bucket, literally. And if creating oversight creates a level of confidence that isn't there in the process by the communities that the law enforcement agency serves, in my view, I think it's well worth that drop in the bucket to have oversight. And I think that the community, the counties that we are currently working with, including even, I think, the deputies who are employed by those sheriffs, would say that there is value and there has been value in the work we've done in Santa Clara and Santa Cruz counties. I will stop there, but I really appreciate your attentiveness. I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have sparked by my opening comments. And I really do appreciate you all attending today, and will do anything I can do to achieve your objectives or help you achieve your objectives. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. But first, Mickey, can you bring us up to date with what's going on in Monterey County?
Okay, thank you, Sharon. I have been sort of the de facto chair of a coalition of about 15 different organizations that's been working on sheriff's oversight for over a year now. And the good thing is that the Board of Supervisors, once it was authorized by statute to impose oversight on the sheriff, did appoint an ad hoc committee last year consisting of 2 of the Board of Supervisors who are in favor of oversight. Unfortunately, it was not clear that the other 3 were in favor of oversight or would end up actually voting for it if they recommended it. So the ad hoc committee was at work. They held 2 public meetings, which were fairly well attended with the coalition people and others who want oversight. And it seemed we were on the right path for a while. Then interference with other issues came up, terrible floods. We've had fires recently. So there have been things that have taken away the board's attention, and also budgetary concerns. There was a freeze on all hiring, and the ad hoc committee kind of lost steam. And the coalition has still remained and remains active in advocating for it, but it's been stalled. The ad hoc committee has been reappointed now for the 2025 year with the same 2 people on it, and that is Supervisor Askew and Supervisor Church. And we do have a newly elected board member. We've met with all the board members. We have a newly elected board member who seems favorable toward oversight, and that would give us 3 of the 5 if they brought something before the board. We have a sheriff, though, who, although she promised to support oversight during her campaign, is opposed to oversight. She said she will abide by whatever the Board of Supervisors do, but the fact is the Board of Supervisors will do whatever she wants done. And so that's another reason that it has been stalled. And we've met with the sheriff, the coalition people have met with the sheriff about 3 times. And she has now said if she had to have oversight, she would prefer an inspector general, but she would still not support oversight, and we have urged her to do so. I should just add very quickly that groups over the years, over decades, since the 90s, have been pushing for oversight in the cities in Monterey County, never with success. Salinas came close once, probably 10 or 12 years ago, but there was no budget. And so it would have been ineffective oversight, and the group working on it said, no, no, thank you. We don't want just oversight on paper. So that's about the status of what's happening in Monterey County, which is a part of the coalition of statewide organizations. And we have learned a lot from them and hope to continue actively being involved in that group too. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you for that summary and for your experience. Now we're ready for some questions. The first one's a long question. Our sheriff in Monterey County is fully cooperating with ICE in releasing incarcerated people to ICE to the extent allowed by California law. To my knowledge, this is the only department in Monterey County cooperating with ICE, contrary to a resolution of support for undocumented immigrant residents adopted by the Board of Supervisors. The county council has advised the board that they cannot change the sheriff's policy because of her constitutional authority. Have you seen in your experience any oversight boards or inspector generals who have effectively changed or modified unwanted policies or practices of the sheriff as part of exercising oversight?
Thank you, Sharon. I'll be happy to answer that question, but let me just go back for a minute to Mickey's comments. I just wanted to say, Mickey, if as you all move forward in working with your ad hoc Board of Supervisors committee, as well as the sheriff herself, I would be happy to meet with either of them if they thought it would be helpful to help explain what I've been doing for 24 years and why I think it is important, effective, and necessary for law enforcement to move forward. I've done that in other counties with various degrees of success. Same is true with regard to county council, the county executive, or anyone else that might have any influence in your county. So I make that offer. With regard to the question, Sharon, the answer is yes. But I'll try to be a little, give it a little more, put a little more meat on that answer. There are countless times in which we have advocated for a change in policy or for a new policy that would provide better guidance to deputies, that would be able to hold deputies accountable once they have that better understanding of what expectations are through policy. And that's sort of our day-to-day work, is seeing what the rules are and seeing whether they provide sufficient guidance to deputies. And if they don't, come up with policies that can provide that guidance through training and expectations set out in writing. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. With regard to the immigration issue as an example, that's a very complicated area in the sense that I don't think anyone really understands the interplay yet, or how this is going to work out between the new initiatives of the federal government on immigration, how that aligns with California's state law that places restrictions on local law enforcement working with ICE, any county initiatives that are intended to weigh in on that debate, and then finally what the sheriff's protocols herself are with regard to how, in fact, if at all, they are going to work with ICE agents. That's very complicated. If you did have an oversight entity, that person could be doing a better job of explaining what the local situation is in a way that you don't have right now. So that's another example of where an independent oversight entity could be reporting on that interplay and how it's working out in paper and in the field and in the jails. There have been some moves by the California legislature to give elected officials more authority on policy development of law enforcement. And maybe the best example of that is the law that was passed 3 or 4 years ago, in which military equipment, as defined by the statutes, um, all law enforcement entities, including sheriff's offices, have to list all military equipment that they possess, have to develop a use policy for that equipment, and have to report annually to elected bodies like the Board of Supervisors on that. And for the first time in California, those bodies have the direct ability to change the policy or reject the policy of the sheriff's office, for example, if they do not feel that they provide sufficient guidance. So that's the first time the California legislature has moved in that direction, although we may see more of that in the coming years.
Thank you. Can a board of supervisors fire a sheriff for bad behavior?
Sharon, you'll have to ask San Mateo County that question, because I think that's a question that's going to be coming up soon in their county. But the answer is, it depends now. But I do think that there are ways through changes in the way in which the governance of a sheriff's office runs, in which that is now possible. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. So, in San Mateo County, there was an election, and now, based on that election, the board may have the authority to oust the sitting sheriff. In Santa Clara County, it was a little different, but in Santa Clara County, and this is true in every county, my understanding is that the grand jury has the power to remove sheriffs. And that's what happened in Santa Clara County. So in Santa Clara County, we did get oversight going. Sheriff Smith did not cooperate with us and did not give us the access to the information we needed to do our work. And that became one of the charges that the grand jury lodged against her after a grand jury investigation. That went to hearing. And based on that hearing, the jury decided to remove her from office. So it can happen.
Interesting. Why was the oversight model in Los Angeles County changed? And I'm assuming from that question that it was changed.
Do you have a few hours? But I'm not sure why it was changed. I think that there was some political reasons and fallout, and the board was looking at a lawsuit in the jails, and I do think they needed somebody to blame, and they needed to try and fix things, and so they reworked their oversight in a way that, in my view, hasn't worked out very well. They have some oversight, but the oversight has been at odds with every sheriff since the creation of the new Inspector General in LA County.
Okay, thank you. What's the advantages or disadvantages of establishing sheriff oversight via the ballot rather than an ordinance passed by the Board of Supervisors?
I'm not hung up so much on the way oversight gets done, as long as it's done in an effective way. So if it's going to be through ballot measure, if it's going to be through an ordinance, it's really important that the ordinance lays out clearly those three, I think, necessary components of oversight. And by the way, I'm an advocate for what I call the hybrid model of oversight, which means that There would be somebody who has some skill, knowledge of police practices, who would be essentially an auditor, inspector general. Um, that doesn't mean that there also can't be a community component that could work with that auditor who lives in the county and has experiences in the county that can be brought to bear on the situation, sort of as community representatives. We have that dynamic in Santa Clara County, and we think that's working out very well.
Very good. Who pays the contractors?
The money comes from, in the counties that we work with, the money comes from the Board of Supervisors out of their general fund.
Okay, not from the sheriff's budget.
No.
Difference between an auditor and inspector general. Can you talk about the difference between an auditor who reviews the report the sheriff does and an inspector general who does an independent investigation?
Sure. Auditor and inspector general are terms that are often used interchangeably. I think inspector general sounds kind of cooler, but other than that, I don't think there's really any difference. The difference is the critical part is what either the auditor or the inspector general, what authority or what ability they have to do. So the devil is really the important part is what's within their scope of work or their jurisdiction, if you will, not so much the title.
Are there examples where the oversight is specific, say just limited to the jail rather than the entire operations of the sheriff's department?
I haven't seen that breakdown in California counties. I suppose you could devise that, but sheriff's departments usually have a very robust patrol function as well. So I would be inclined not to be that specific, and really I think the critical piece is to really have um, authority over the whole organization. I think that's the best way to go, although limiting it, starting out at the jails might be sort of a phased in approach to see how that works before going to the patrol setting. Certainly if the community's concerns are more about the jails than they are about patrol, that's possible, but I think ideally it would be the whole organization.
Does oversight have any ability to change accreditation programs to align with common findings? CALEA, I guess CALEA, is supposed to be the gold standard for law enforcement standards, which goes above and beyond the peace officer standards and training bar.
Yeah, CALEA is a credential organization, and it's a for-profit organization, and they do provide credentialing, and they do a lot with regard to ensuring that there are regular audits of the evidence locker, et cetera. But my concern about CALEA, if they just go the CALEA route, I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't, is that there's almost no transparency with regard to that CALEA process. And there is no real public reporting on progress. That's just not their thing.
Okay, that's good to know. Can a sheriff department be forced to adopt regulation, change policies, and hold their deputies and their medical contract employees responsible for in-custody deaths?
No. With some caveats. I mean, I do think that there is a state board that sort of oversees all of the county jails, and I guess in an egregious situation, it could remove authority over the jails from a sheriff who was malfeasant, involved in malfeasance or what have you. But I haven't seen it done, not in recent history. So while I think theoretically it's out there, in reality it hasn't happened, and I would be very surprised if it ever did.
You mentioned growing pains in a few cases where oversight was adopted. Could you say a little bit more about that? And can those growing pains be used by a sheriff to resist change?
Yes. I'll use Sacramento County as an example. They created an inspector general who was a very respected retired law enforcement official. And he wrote a critical report on an officer-involved shooting involving a deputy in Sacramento County. And after issuance of the report, the sheriff um, locked the IG out of his office, and the IG never went back to work. So there's an example of how a sheriff can impede oversight or remove oversight in that case.
Have you seen situations where the deputy seems to have control over the sheriff?
Not as described, but what I can say is that certainly an important component of of any kind of change that impacts working conditions, like the creation of oversight, should involve discussions with the association who represents the union, the deputies. There often is an association that represents first level supervisors. There's a union that usually represents the classified workers or the non-peace officers. And ideally, you'd want to have discussions with those individuals about what oversight looks like to get them on board. You can get them on board, though. And the fact that we have a vibrant oversight in the two counties that we work with shows that the unions aren't always going to say no and are not always going to be resistant to it.
In charter counties, I think there are 14 of them. You need a charter amendment to fire the sheriff, which San Mateo County just has passed an amendment to that effect. But in general law counties, this writer believes that they can fire the sheriff. So do you want to make a distinction between charter and general county power?
Yeah. I do think that there is more flexibility with general counties as opposed to charter counties. I'm not an expert in this area because I'm not in the business of firing sheriffs. I'm really in the business of oversight. And so what I would prefer to do is not get anyone fired. And I actually told this to Sheriff Smith. What I wanted to do was work with her, but short of that, the grand jury ended up doing what the grand jury did. That wasn't my decision. It was the grand jury's decision. But all that being said, I would prefer to work with anyone that's willing to work with us.
Have you seen a civilian lawsuit regarding a city or county not having oversight?
No. Well, there may have been a lawsuit, but I don't think anything would be successful with regard to that. So yeah, I don't think that would be a valid cause of action because the state constitution does not require oversight for any law enforcement entity at all.
Okay. And then there was a comment here that the Board of Supervisors can control what the sheriff does through the budget process. San Mateo County passed an ordinance prohibiting the use of county resources like staff time, fax machines, phones to collaborate with ICE. I don't know if there's anything to comment on there.
No, I mean, the budget is an indirect way of having leverage over the head of the agency, but it's very indirect. And I don't find it to be, I have not found it to be very effective in my experience.
Thank you for all these candid answers. And then here's George Riley's question. What's your experience with grand juries?
I think grand juries can be helpful, insightful, but and they have a lot of authority. The problem with grand juries is that while they are representatives of the community, which is good, and voices of the community, which is also good, um, it's usually a volunteer experience, and the people on the grand jury are not skilled in the intricacies of law enforcement, which is getting more complicated every day. So that's the downside to the grand jury system. I think grand juries have effectuated systemic and individual change over the years. But I do think because of that fact that they're part-time volunteer people that don't have the experience of policing, that sometimes they don't have the credibility needed to effectuate change. And in most counties, in my experience, their recommendations are only that, and the sheriff can, if the sheriff wants, ignore those recommendations.
Thank you very much. You have really been able to clearly articulate so much information. It's going to take a while to really integrate all of this. And we want to really appreciate your time and your offer to meet with some of the decision makers or those who need education about civilian oversight. So if you have any last words, and then maybe I will ask if there's anyone coming from another county who would like to talk about their experience for 2 minutes. Any last words, Mike?
Oh, no, just thank you again for the invitation. I meant it when I extended an invitation to those who I'm just seeing for the first time, that this does not have to be the beginning and end of our discussion. If you don't mind, Sharon, if somebody could put my email address in the chat so people will have it. If you can't grab it right now, I'm pretty easy to find. Just Google my first and last name and you'll find our website and you can find us that way. But I really appreciate your interest and your advocacy for getting this component going in Monterey County and elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. Indeed. Okay, now we have some volunteers who would like to tell us something about what went on in their county. And I see Norma Nelson.
Hi there. Thank you so much. This was a very helpful presentation. Norma Nelson, I'm from Sacramento County. And interesting that you brought up Sacramento County being one of the first oversight entities. I think back in the day that they did in fact have a body that was advisory to the sheriff, but that was pretty much about it. And unfortunately, even though we have adopted sort of an oversight entity under AB 1185 as authorized by the signing of the governor into law, it was interesting that you mentioned about having those reports from the Inspector General in writing. And thus far, we have a new Inspector General who has been with us about a year. And I've not yet, he's independent, but I have not yet seen any written reports from him. And all of his reports have been verbal, which thank you for reminding me that we need to go back and there needs to be some accountability there. Um, but one question that I would ask, if I could ask a question, and maybe I can ask it offline, is that the community actually worked hard to try to put in place, the strongest oversight entity that we could, given the conservative nature of our Board of Supervisors. And it was fairly strong in some respects, but there isn't the independence there that was one of the essential elements that you talked about, because our county council and staff, they're all advisors to our representatives on our oversight entity. And so all of the training and everything that flows through and how the commission is governed, it's based from the perspective of the county. And of course, it's in their favor and not necessarily the community's favor. So in any event, the challenge now is to try to work with the Board of Supervisors and our oversight entity to try to retain the powers that we currently have and to encourage more community participation, to give the Board of Supervisors incentive to want to make it stronger. So, but anyway, I appreciate all that you've done, and it's really quite a challenge. The other thing is that there's a heavy presence of law enforcement and conservatives on our oversight entity. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Norma. And is that was that Ann Cooper? Irma Cooper. Yes. Irma?
Hi, I'm Irma, and I am one of the commissioners that serve on the Los Angeles Sheriff Oversight Commission. Thank you for the invite, because this have been very, very helpful. I just want to state that our commission has put in a proposed revision to get a little bit more power for our commission. And I was happy to hear from Michael that within our proposal, those three critical elements that you discussed, we had in our revised uh, revision to chapter 3.79. So as far as being independent, having access to confidential information, and being able to truly do complete investigation. So I just want to thank you for that, because it seems with our proposed revision, we're heading in the right direction to be a more effective group. I am basically new. I'm going into my 3rd year with the commission, but I just appreciate the oversight, because I truly believe the sheriff's department nor the police department can more or less investigate themselves. It has to be an outside, independent agency doing that. The other things that we are going through right now is that we've had a lot of issues in our jails. And I don't know, just recently this morning, there was an attack on 4 officers in one of our facilities. But it only tells one side of the story, and we know there's always 2 sides to the story. I don't believe in violence, to any of our officers, because we need officers to maintain order and safety for us all. But people just don't attack you just to be attacking you. So something happened. And the fact that the cameras was off, and just to say that they were being, maintained or something, but, why would all the cameras be off? That just doesn't make sense. But, we have a lot of issues that we need to resolve, and we have family members that show up and they want answers. And it's difficult for us to provide transparency if we have no access. So we're really working on that so that we can be a really effective oversight. So thank you for all the information. It just confirms and verifies that we're in the right direction, and hopefully we can get these changes made. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Duffy?
So getting to effective oversight in Sonoma County was a decades. Oh, first, thank you, Mike, for a fantastic talk, and I'm super impressed that it doesn't seem like you prepared this. You just ripped it off the top of your head, which just shows what a god you are in oversight. So really, thank you. Getting to oversight in Sonoma County was a decades-long endeavor. Back in the late 1990s, we had a series of killings by law enforcement of civilians. A group of community organizers agitated and wound up getting the California Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission to come to the county and hold a series of hearings and issue a report. And in that report were a number of recommendations. And one of those recommendations was that the sheriff's office immediately establish civilian oversight. That report came out in the year 2000. Nothing happened. 13 years later, in 2013, as sheriff's deputy, they continued to have a lot of problems, but the the inciting incident for getting oversight for us after having the report was the sheriff's deputy shot and killed a 13-year-old young boy who was playing with a toy gun in an abandoned lot at like 3 seconds after he arrived at the scene. He showed up, pulled out the gun, and killed the kid. So our supervisors established a body of 21 people to issue some recommendations. That body met for 16 months, almost weekly, a number of community organizers. At this point, I was involved. I didn't get involved in the 1990s. We got a recommendation for civilian oversight for the sheriff's office for a hybrid model. So we have a hybrid model here. That model got authorized in 2015, funded and staffed in 2016, and they appointed people for the Citizens Board. I served on the Citizens Board for the first 4 years of it. We found ourselves being threatened. Anything that is established by a board of supervisors can be taken away by a board of supervisors. And we had one supervisor who never liked oversight, and he got another one on his side, and we got a 5-person board. So at our annual report hearing in 2018, we thought we were going to lose the board because we knew we had 2 people up there and they just had to convince one more to get rid of it. And the sheriff hated oversight and kept saying it was a waste of money and blah, 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 and didn't like the auditor. So we had to go to the ballot. So I'm going to stop as I'm being told to. But I'm a big fan of going to the ballot because if they can give it to you, they can take it away. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you for reconnecting us. Good to see some familiar faces and glad to meet the new ones. Thank you very much.